All right, Chairman.
Hello.
It's been another week in Tone on our proverbial route to Tone Town. How are things? How are things in your worlds as far as your trajectory as you get to Tone Town? Anybody want to weigh in?
I think I've been in a little bit of reverse this week, actually. I've taken a couple spins away, I would say. I ripped apart. Since moving to Canada, I actually haven't had a finished pedalboard for myself, which is probably not the best
Tale
thing
as
to
old
say.
as time.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there's a few metaphors out there for why my pedalboard is not finished.
Right.
But yeah, set up a layout for a pedalboard, is pretty happy 2 weeks ago. Not a single thing has happened. It's just a layout on a pedalboard right now. Actually, the pedals have come off the board and still nothing has been done. So I've made negative progress, if that's even a term. So I'm a little bit further away than probably a couple of weeks ago. Brian, maybe you can maybe redeem this a little bit and move us forward.
I mean, I had a whole setup and everything. It was nice and fancy, and it was a big old PBC 10 switcher system, and I loved it, but my back didn't, so I condensed a lot of it down to this little like 18 by 12 board, no switcher, like the timeline changing. No switcher. Well, the timeline is changing the Big Sky presets, so when I change a delay, it'll either stay that delay or stay that reverb or change to a different reverb. So I'm like going real minimal with a pedal that I have as well as an overdrive and a case here. Like, it's simple. I played this past weekend. I was like, oh, okay. I actually didn't mind it. I like the switcher system, but it's just so big. So yeah, it's been a lot of back and forth and gear selling and whatnot. So it's been bumpy, but we're getting
I don't
back.
know if you guys find this, but I will say this is definitely off topic, but I think maybe relevant. Let's go with maybe. I find it so refreshing when I've had a massive pedalboard, which is usually slowly built up over time, and then I just cull it. I just go down to like 4 pedals and nothing fancy at all, just series one into another, and I limit my options like crazy, and it is it's like a weight lifted off my shoulders, and inevitably I add 1 pedal, 2 pedal, switcher comes back, and then I end up with a big board 6 months later. But it's just this recurring process of giant call back to small, slowly build up, and then call it back. Yeah. And I just love it. I'm never happier than when I have a tiny board.
That's the yo-yo dieting of pedal boards.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering what the term was, and so now I know. It's like I'm just
yo-yo pedal
perpetual yo-yoing on my rig. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about yourself,
Same.
Mason? How's the journey been the last week?
You know, I have to say there hasn't been explicitly any tone related items, but something that piqued my interest, at least it may not pique anybody else's, and I guess it's in some way an ancillary connection to Tone Town. As I was thinking about, somebody had brought to my attention, again, follow me here, that Sally Field, the actress, is the spokesperson for osteoporosis, the thinning of your bones. And I was thinking, I'm getting older. Who's going to be the spokesperson for my generation if Sally is the spokesperson for the boomers?
Fair question.
And I was thinking several things. Firstly, one of the most popular hip hop groups for my generation, Bone Thugs and Harmony, would be a great spokespeople for osteoporosis for our generation.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I was thinking about musically, which is a challenge, is if you're familiar with their music, they're actually never harmonized. They're all in unison. So this is just one thing that I was considering. Bone Thugs, obviously, because of the bone component and osteoporosis. Great, and you could have in several of the different Bone Thugs, Busy Bone, Crazy Bone, to kind of weigh in on how whatever AstraZeneca product has, rejuvenated their bones and helped calcify them. And
Of course.
I know it's a little distant, but that was one thing I was thinking about this week in the musical connection is, were the Bone Thugs and Harmony actually harmonized? I don't think they were. I think they were only in unison. So just a takeaway that I had for this week.
Interesting.
I appreciate it. Of all the things I thought we were going to talk about today, that was not one of them. But I'm glad we went there.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot more about hip hop music this week because I shot a video about the best guitar parts in hip hop music, and so I was researching a lot of 80s, 90s, and mostly early 2000s hip hop music, and although they weren't known for having great guitar parts in their songs, they were a recurring sort of like hit group during that time. So, anyways, thought if the Bone Thugs, if you're listening, just to kind of think about, instead of doing the Mortgage tour as you kind of get older, we could think about becoming spokespeople for osteoporosis. Yeah, because Sally Field, she can only do it for so long,
It's true.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I think about how that segue is going to go, transitioning from Sally to the Bone Thugs.
Well, I like to think of it as in like, you have the bones in your body, which are a key structure and foundation. And just like we are about to talk about some cable related stuff, they could be considered maybe some of the foundation or the bones, if you will, of your pedal board.
Yeah, the bones of the pedal board. And I appreciate, and I saw what you did there, and I appreciate that, Grant.
That's good.
I'm here to help.
And I don't think that there's any better jumping off point than that to act as a springboard for what we're going to talk about today, which is kind of all things cables, and not so much just what cable brands we like, because we've talked about that to a degree about what we like on the pedal board, but I think that this is cables from A to Z, when it starts coming out of your guitar and when it ends going into your amplifier. There are different cables and different sorts of metrics that you need to be looking at and considering when you're choosing the cable that you want. And we're also going to talk about things like soldered versus solderless. I know that this is a contentious issue for many people. I know that there's a lot of solderless cable apologists out there, and this is going to be a good video for you. And we're also going to talk about how the plugs can also affect the sound separately from the cables themselves, because a lot of times we'll see people using really robust plugs or asking, should I be using this really huge, military grade plug on my pedal board, or should I be using something more kind of smaller and more sparse for the pedal board. We're going to get into all that stuff. But I think maybe we could just do a quick refresher for everybody here as far as what kind of cables we typically like to use on the pedal board. And that's kind of, between the first pedal and the last pedal, and maybe just kind of refresh people on model numbers if they're interested in going and purchasing some of these themselves, maybe DIYing their cables. When do you guys want to start us off when we're talking about cables on the board?
Yeah, I can go. Cables on the board. I know there's a lot of different types of brands, but ever since I've started, it's always been Mogami. I think when I first started out, it kind of fluctuated between pricing and everything in the beginning, but I quickly realized, I think I even used like George L cable for a while and like stripped it back and used it with plugs, which
God bless you.
Don't recommend doing that. I don't recommend it. I learned very quickly that was a bad idea. So yeah, mine is typically like a Mogami 2319, a single. It's like for patch. I always say it's like point to point, so it's pedal to pedal. Then I'll use like 2528 Mogami. It's the same thing as 2314, just there's two cables in it. And I use that for a lot of the switching systems because it makes the bundles and the runs a little bit smaller. So that's me.
Smaller the bundle, the better.
Yeah.
Yep. That's fair. I'd be very similar. I would be using Mogami for just about everything, unless the customer kind of asks for something else. And I know we'll get into this, but I feel like once you kind of find a cable that you like and you like the sound of and you like working with, it's hard to move away from that, and your ears kind of get used to what that cable sounds like, and it's just kind of comfortable and it's home. And so Mogami is that for me. I think it's a great cable to use, and I'm comfortable with it and really enjoy working with it. I kind of just know it, you know how to cut the jacket, you know how to bring the ground back and get rid of everything else that does need to be there quickly and easily and all that. And whenever I'm working with another cable, I'm like, I just want my Mogami back, you know? I want home back. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, that's like this pair of wire strippers I have. Let me grab them. I use these guys to do. So these, whatever, it splits it apart. On some cabling that I use, like I know which hole I need to use to strip it back perfectly and not like rip out any grounds, but some cabling, like I can't even use that because like it just like rips out all the ground, and I'm just like, I hate this so much. So that's
if you ever hear a loud scream out of Brian's shop, a different cable has made it into his bench.
Exactly. I did it one time and I was like, oh, this is annoying. But yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah. What about you, Mason?
Or the scream could be from the Brazilian waxing adhesive removal technique of getting
glue off
old Velcro adhesive off your pedal board.
Yep. Oh my gosh, I have blisters all over my hands from having to roll off some Velcro off of a board, and then Grant posted that, and I was like, what am I doing with my life?
It was pretty funny though. As a quick aside, like I posted a video on how to get the glue off, and then same day was it? Someone back in Australia had posted needed to get minor surgery on their thumb from rolling glue off the pedal board. I was like, man, what a coincidence. Yeah, this quick reel was just use a heat gun and the sticky side of some packing tape or gaff tape or whatever it is, and you don't have to get minor surgery after a couple of pedal boards.
Or I like using just old Velcro. Hook and loop Velcro is also great for that.
Anything with that kind of adhesive, hey.
Yeah, and if you can't visualize, we're talking about, again, a video that Grant had posted earlier this week to show how to remove Velcro adhesive that's stuck to your pedal board, which I primitively call the Brazilian waxing technique, where in essence you reapply the Velcro to the adhesive, and then you pull it off in a forceful motion, thereby taking the old adhesive away from the pedal board surface. And our friend Roger at Signal Chain in Australia hurt himself. Shout out to Roger, who's got a great store in Brisbane. Poor guy, man. Velcro accidents, man.
Which Brazilian waxing technique, another idea for a future sponsor for the show.
Yeah.
Yes. So if anybody out there, has any connections with different Brazilian, maybe DIY kits, we've already put feelers out for AstraZeneca, Flomax, and I'm not sure which company Sally Field is associated with for osteoporosis, but if you know anybody or if you're with one of those companies, we'll certainly entertain offers to that end.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a tangent. Sorry about that.
Some people have credited Sally Field with making osteoporosis cool again. So,
make osteoporosis cool again. So doctor's orders is get the wax, right? What's the wax? What kind of wax?
The wax in this case is whatever adhesive comes from your kind of hook and loop Velcro backing.
Yeah.
I think that's the number one. I think Dual Lock and our Power Grip don't leave that same residue, and so you don't really have that problem. It's just hard to get it off.
Yeah,
it's just hard to get off the physical Velcro itself. But the hook and loop stuff that you get like on a pedal train or something like that, that's the stuff that can be really gnarly and difficult to get. And I'll tell you, the worst thing to remove of all time is the padded backing on a TC Electronic flanger chorus pitch shifter. Those are brutal, and there's like a mesh that's woven into the padding, so it's like doubly hard to get out. it's like those security price stickers that are on clothing, so you can't peel them off to like put the price tag on something else. And so it's like perforated. They basically, TC Electronic on that product only, the stereo chorus pitch shifter flanger, they have figured out a way to engineer the most problematic adhesive backed padding of all time. I remember on one really destroying the back trying to get that off, and it was very difficult. It was very difficult. I literally had to, after I was finished with it, one of my friends that does powder coat, I had to send him the back to sandblast and powder coat it because I destroyed it so bad. Yeah, very difficult.
Well, congrats to TC Electronic for the most difficult padded removal. Yep.
Yeah, if we can, maybe we'll send them a plaque.
Yeah, I think we should.
Gosh.
So shout out Mr. and Mrs. Electronic.
Yep.
Well done.
Tom and Caroline.
Tom and Caroline Electronic. Yeah. Yep. From Denmark.
Electronique.
Yeah. Back to cables.
Okay.
Let's do it.
I too am a big fan of the 2314, and if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see it here. I've got it on my screen. I like getting it from Performance Audio. I think they're about the cheapest I've found. 30 cents a foot is pretty incredible for this. Of course, if you want to get like a 600-foot roll, you can. Let's see how much it says. $179.99. I mean, that's think
insane.
about it this way. That's $179.99 away from free. That's
a good way to put it.
Think about it, it's practically free. It's so inexpensive. This is great. This is really great if you want to have something that's really, really thin. That's going to be great for switcher rigs. You can of course get something like the 2319. It's a little thicker than this. And a little bit more expensive, and this can be really good for maybe something that's not using a switcher. The problem though is, and this is where everybody messes it up, they forget to remove that thermal conductive plastic, right? This black stuff right here. This needs to be totally removed. If this is not removed, you're gonna have big time problems when you go.
So the picture, if you're watching, is incorrect. Your cable should not look like that when you're about ready to solder to a plug.
It should look clear with this peeled away, and I think actually maybe this image kind of shows it a little better.
The old 2319.
Yeah, so it shows that there's a little bit of the center conductor insulation exposed. You should just peel this thing all the way down to the hilt. Just get rid of it. You don't want to see any of that stuff. It's going to put a resistive load on your cabling. And then what's the other one that you use, Brian, that's kind of more for like a Y cable that has like a seam on it? Is that the 25, or is it 20?
2528.
Yeah,
2528. Let's see if they got it here on
It's like for the insert
audio.
cables or the Y cables.
Yeah, 2528. We're sharing the screen here if you want to take a look, if you're over on YouTube. In essence, this is actually, in some ways, if you're doing a switcher, even better value, because you're basically getting two 2314s per side.
Yep.
That have a seam in the middle. Now, you can just pull them apart and use them as individual cables, but if you're using it as a Y cable, it's really, really helpful to use this together. And the cool thing about this, too, is that you don't have any of the black conductive plastic of death. You don't even have to worry about that step when you're doing this. And 60 cents a foot is pretty great, because you're basically saying, okay, it's 30 cents a foot because you get double the amount of cable. And then if you buy the full roll,
if it's less than 360, it's
better.
So it's exactly double.
It's exactly double
because
it's exactly the same thing. But the cool thing about this from an organizational standpoint, if you're doing a switcher, is you have this white line on one side of the cable. And again, if you're listening to this, you're just going to have to close your eyes and imagine, unless you're on the road, don't close your eyes, or close one eye. And your non-dominant eye, close that one, and you're gonna have a white line that goes on one side of the cable seam, and then one that's just kind of ordinary black. And so you can assign the line to one of this, the send or the return. And so you can just kind of keep that consistency. You always know, okay, I got a white line here. This is definitely a send, you know.
Which
as
I
you're
think
doing
controversially, Brian assigns to the tip usually on a TRS plug, and I assign to ring. Who's to say who's right? That's another podcast entirely.
Right.
But yes, that you can decide for yourself which one you want to assign where.
And these are all great cables for on the pedal board. Now, some people might say, well, why don't you use the larger 2524, which is like kind of the largest, robust Mogami cable? Why wouldn't you just use the best, the biggest? And I think that there's a couple of things to consider on a pedal board that maybe those who are not, you know, doing this a lot or have a full understanding of the electronics of it, why you wouldn't use something like that. From an assembly standpoint, can you imagine doing a switcher rig with 2524 and how thick that cable is and how inflexible it is comparatively, trying to do big cable runs, big looms? I mean, just the weight and the size of the cable is prohibitive for a compact rig. And in terms of the tonal aspect, on a pedal board, it's all low impedance. Even if you're not using great buffers, the difference between what your guitar pickups can drive and even a Boss pedal can drive are considerably different. So the impact of the cable on the pedal board is way less significant than the cable before you get to the pedal board. The cable before the pedal board being the most significant, the cable on the pedal board being considerably less significant. And the better the quality of the buffer, if you're using a Goodwood audio buffer, or you're using a Vertex buffer, or you're using one of the kind of approved buffers that we've talked about in some of the other episodes, those are going to be examples of things where if you use those, the cable differences are going to be very nominal. If you use a 2319 or a 2314 or an Evidence Audio or a Canary, the differences between those sound-wise is going to be negligible because they're all getting this low impedance signal, and, you know, spec differences in terms of capacitance, whether it's, you know, 10 more picofarads per foot or 10 less, negligible. When you get outside of the pedal board, however, that really changes. But before we get to that point where we get outside of the pedal board, maybe let's talk a little bit about plug choice and why maybe we wouldn't want to use giant Neutrik plugs. So for example, going back to my screen share, let me just pull up an example of a Neutrik plug so people kind of can visualize, for those who are watching here, what I mean by this. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. We're just going to go back to our friends over at Performance Audio, who I think have really great prices. We're not sponsored by them, although we would be open to it, Performance Audio. So here are some examples of Neutrik plugs, and you've probably seen, you know, this type of plug some point in your life if you're watching. These are kind of they're made in I believe Liechtenstein. European made. They have silent plugs, straight plugs. I've seen some people, some rig builders, build entire rigs using Neutrik plugs, and they're really big, they're really robust, and I think some people who, you know, don't do this professionally are like, of course you would use this huge, you know, robust plug throughout the entire pedal board. Why wouldn't you? And your response to that would be,
how big do you want your pedal board to be, would be my first question. Especially in some of these examples with a switcher, you can't use the right angle Neutriks. You have to use the straights, which, if you're listening, these are like instrument cable plugs. Like, they're the ones you plug in and out of your guitar. They're big. And so a straight plug is probably, what, 2.5 inches?
yeah.
And that across a switcher, that equals 2 to 3 pedals maybe that you can no longer fit on your board due to this. And also, when you think about the fact that the people using these plugs are probably the same ones that are wanting to use instrument cable 2524, the big stuff, your pedal board is going to be, I'd say, probably 30% bigger across those two choices alone. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Brian?
I mean, not to mention the plug size, but the cabling out of the plug, having the loop down or wherever you're trying to route it to, that's gonna add extra, more space. I tell people all the time, they're like, oh yeah, I really want to do this switcher. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at right angle plugs. Oh no, I want to do straight plugs. Okay, which ones? And they show the launchers. I'm like, no, that's gonna, like, if you're trying to go for a 32 by 16, that's gonna take it up to like a 32 by 20, just because of the overall depth of the board just increases. It's
more is
very
not always
inconvenient.
more. There we go.
No, not always.
Yep.
Yeah, I think all these things are true, and I think that the design of a Neutrik plug is really not for the purposes of a pedal board. And I think even if you called Neutrik and you got a hold of one of their engineers, yeah, John J. Neutrik,
yes.
I think he would tell you
Good man.
that there isn't any reason to. These are not designed for that purpose. They're not designed for stationary pedals that are going to be in a fixed position on a pedal board. They're not designed for that. And secondarily, I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is electrically, these have a ton of capacitance relative to the pedal board based plugs that most of us use. We are primarily, at least amongst us, either are using square plugs. I know, Grant, you have your own version of kind of like a switch, more of a switchcraft style plug. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the capacitance on those smaller plugs is considerably different. Where I've done, and I actually have a sheet somewhere on my website that I did almost 10 years ago. So it's not as up to date with all the new fancy square plugs, but I'm trying to see if I can bring it up here for the purposes of this conversation, where in essence I measure. Okay, here it is. I measure all the capacitance of all of kind of the major plugs out there, and there's like some plugs are equal to, like a Neutrik plug is equal to several feet of cable just by using one, right? And you're using two of them. So if you had a 1 foot cable that was connecting two pedals, you have more capacitance in the plugs than you do in the actual cable itself. And capacitance is sort of the measurement that a lot of people use as kind of the X factor when determining what cable they may want to use. So let me just share my screen here real quick. So this is like a little article that I had written. And at that time, we were having some plugs made for us by a company in Italy. They're no longer made, so you can omit any of them that say our company name on it. But we go through and we measure the capacitance, the picofarad.
Wow. And
you can see here that some of them are really quite high. G&H quite high, Switchcraft quite high in terms of its capacitance per. When you're looking at, some of the bigger Neutrik ones like we saw here, those are, 30 to 40 picofarads per connector, relative to, ours would kind of be more close to like what the Switchcraft or kind of the mini cakes might be, which is, under 10, 6.6. So there's a huge margin of difference between a Neutrik at, 33 or 42 picofarads per plug, which means you're at 84 or 66 picofarads for a set, versus 13 per set if you're using kind of like a square plug or a mini cake or something like what Grant's using, which are not designed to be these huge robust plugs because the application is not the same. So I think that the two things I would say to somebody that wants to use these really huge Neutrik plugs on the pedal board is you're going to have more capacitance likely in your plugs than you are in your entire cable runs. And I know that what we said earlier about the buffers, using good quality buffers, is going to make a lot of that negligible. But if you keep stacking the deck against yourself by using stuff that not only is going to increase the size of your pedal board, is going to decrease the flexibility because you are going to be using larger cables, have, more weight, more space that it needs to be able to accommodate to make these runs, more stress on the cables unless you, really space things out. it doesn't seem like it's advantageous at all. Certainly not for the tone.
No,
let alone the other factors.
Especially if you are gonna switch out stuff. Let's be honest, we all like to buy gear and switch stuff out. So like the people are like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna switch stuff out. You're good. Factor in that you're going to switch something with that overdrive because someone else is gonna come out with something that you're gonna want to try. And if you get big thick cables with big right angle plugs and you have it wired to go top jack, but then that new pedal is side jack, like that's gonna mess you up as well for your spacing of switching stuff out.
And you're not going to get to do the Omilion technique where you put cables underneath, you're not going to be able to feed a cable at a 25-24 underneath a pedal with dual lock as the clearance.
I get that all the time. People are always like, how do you get this stuff under the pedal? I'm like, it's dual lock, babe. Like, that's what I said to one guy. I was like, and the guy was like, luckily he was a friend of mine. And he was like, seriously? I was like, yeah, well, yeah, it's all about just tucking like the extra cable and you can hide it and still swap stuff out. But yeah, I agree with you on that.
Yeah. So I think on the pedal board, just to kind of summarize, Mogami 2314 is great. 2528 is great. 2319 is great. We don't recommend using 2524, which is the big guy, on the pedal board, nor do we recommend Neutrik plugs. Brian and I think, are primarily using square plugs, and Brian uses also the mini cakes, and some of the creation stuff. Grant has his own brand of Goodwood audio plugs, which I've never used.
Also use square plugs, though.
You also use square plugs?
Also use square plugs, yep.
Yep. And so Grant uses a combination and also has, I don't know if it's appropriate to say, Grant, but in development, a possible new plug that could replace them all.
One plug to rule them all is what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping.
So there's also that on the horizon for those of you who are planning your next DIY rig build. So I think that encompasses well what we're using on the pedal board itself. If you're interested in other on the pedal board types of cables, we did talk about that in our materials podcast, so you can get a little bit more information on what we use for MIDI or TRS and things like that. But we're kind of restricted to the instrument cables at this point. Let's now kind of move off of the pedal board and talk about maybe the types of cables that we would use coming from the guitar into the pedal board, which I call that the input cable, and then going out of the pedal board to the amp, which I call the output cable. Do you guys have any kind of leaders of the pack in those particular positions? And maybe we could talk about plug types in there as well.
Yeah,
I use what do I use for my instrument cable? I've had I tested out an instrument cable just for fun. It was an Evidence Audio. Brian, you might know this better than me, or Mason. It was one of their instrument cables. It's just a straight green.
Lyric.
I think it was Lyric. Let's go with Lyric. And I made that, 6-7 years ago.
Is it kind of the purplish one? Or
it's
is it the
green,
one?
Just green, no cloth.
Straight green.
Yeah. It's just the rubber's the wrong word, but it's not the cloth covered ones.
It's either it's like PVC or could be neoprene.
It's a braided cable, so it's not solid core. Yeah, there's no tech flex on the outside.
Oh, okay.
It's just standard cable, and I put G&H ends on the end of it. And the reason I use the G&H ones is, and again, this may just be a sales tactic I fell for, but I really do enjoy the G&H plugs. They have a copper center down the tip of the plug, and so if the plug bends, it actually doesn't break the connection. Since the copper is a bit more of a softer metal, it actually bends with it as well. And so I just put some G&H ends on it, and this thing has lasted me for, like I said, 6-7 years of using it pretty consistently, and I really enjoy it. Sounds great, and I use that as my input cable. And so far, no issues there. I've used tons of Mogami 2524 as well. But I will say, for the most part, the only thing I really look for an input cable is how short can I make it before it becomes impractical. So for me, I know you guys look at me, you listen to me on the podcast, and you think, man, this guy, he's high energy, he's outgoing, life of the party. Not at all. But I don't move around a lot when I'm playing, so I can have a short cable. 10 to 12 feet is all I need. And the shorter the cable, the closer you're going to be to guitar to amp, especially before that buffer kind of comes into play on the pedal board. So I'm going as short as possible. Use a good quality cable. Use some robust plugs like the Neutrix or G&H or something else that may come up, and then I'm happy.
I'm surprised you didn't mention your Australian brethren over at Amphenol.
I have gone the Amphenol route. When Goodwood first started, we used Amphenol, and I quickly moved away. I moved over to Neutrix.
Yeah. Our old friends in Amphenol. Oh, I will say on the G&H, I have nothing against their plugs, but as far as the copper center thing, everybody got played, because if you think about where the connection point is of a jack, it never touches the tip. Like, it's in the center of the tip, right?
Yep.
So you have no contact with that.
But that's
at
actually
all.
not what it was about. And this actually got tested because I got stage managed, which basically someone tripped on my cable and ripped my cable. Mm-hmm. And I've had the G&H ones bend probably 20 degrees, and they still work. And so it's less about the copper on copper connection and more about having a flexible center that won't snap but will bend.
I always thought their and I could be wrong about this, but I always thought that their thing was, it has the best conductivity because it has this copper center.
I'm sure that was part of it. Yeah,
and
I'm sure it was.
And I always said, because they had called me about using them, and I was like, well, it's not making contact with the jack there. The center tip doesn't touch anything.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my quick. My quick bashing of G&H, but they do actually make mechanically they're great plugs. Every plug company has their differentiators, and they're all trying to
stand out.
And this is one of them. So I have no qualms with that. I think it's all part of the game. But just wanted to mention that if you were buying a G&H plug specifically because it had that copper center, as Grant has attested, they work well, or they still perform even when bent. So if your plug has Peyronie's disease, it can work pretty good. But as far as the conductivity of the copper center, not really a thing that's going to help you. Yep. What about you, Brian?
So it kind of depends, because are we going personally, or are we going in just a recommendation for
we can go either. We can go either.
Okay.
We can go personal.
Yeah.
And then
depends how much you're willing to share, Brian.
So from my experience, and I tell everyone I base recommendations off of stuff I've personally used and I trust, because I'm not going to recommend something that I've never used. That's just like a car salesman be like, oh yeah, you should buy, it's the best car if it's the best on gas. Well, have you ever owned it and driven it? Oh no, I just read the specs. Okay, well, test it out, make sure you like it, that kind of thing. Same thing kind of happens with gear, as we all know. So me personally, sometimes I run a wireless Sennheiser unit system and everything, so the cabling loom and stuff is a little bit different, or it's right next to my board, so it's it's a patch cable, like a 2319 cable. I personally found this company Cauliflower Cables, these really nice cable. If I find my camera, really nice. I like the strength of the really solid Tex Flex and of the heat shrink, just kind of protecting the area where that instrument cable is going to be. Something that's really dependable. I mean, I had monster cables growing up, and I had the live wire, whatever, all sorts of different ones. I had anyone that had that live. I don't. Which one?
I thought it was live wire.
Live wire. I'm not sure. Well, I had the monster ones because of the lifetime warranty, which I never broke a cable. But what I found with these ones is that they're just very dependable, very robust and everything, and they were really affordable. But they also on their website, if I can even share it, if you're watching, you can see, if I can find it right here, is on their website. You can actually see, and this isn't, they didn't ask me to do this. I just really love this cable, and I have a bunch of them. But you can pick different, the length, the plugs. It tells you all the information about the cabling. It tells you the capacitance, which is really cool. So there's a lot of cool information. It's not one of those things like you can just pick out a cable. Like, it's not a buy now thing where you just buy it and it's ready to go. Like, you can go and customize and you can pick your options and silent plug. So like, it's the same thing in your gear or whatever you do, is like, you want to take the time to pick out that instrument cable, because I had a couple other cables that I would use, and then I used this one and I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't notice I was losing that high end. So like, that first in makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
I will say one thing though, one complaint that we got when we used to make tech flexed instrument leads was on certain stages, ones that are maybe glossed or, not carpeted, let's say.
Yeah.
Tech flex makes a slippery, a tripping hazard, and it makes it slippery. And so we got like, specific requests like, do not put tech flex on because people are slipping on stage on my cable. So that's a practical thing to look out for as well. Not related to tone, more related to the next gig. If you want to keep playing it and you don't want to trip up your front man. Sometimes you're over your front man and you just want to see him go. Use tech flex. That's the way to do it.
Yeah. I think that input cables, just to go back to, because we're talking about this cable that connects from the guitar to the pedal board, the first cable that your guitar is seen, pending that you're not using active pickups or a preamp inside of your guitar, that is the most important cable of the entire rig. Presuming that all of your connections are good, thereafter, it is the most important cable in the rig. And the reason why is that your pickups are passive and are not particularly good at driving any capacitance on the output of your guitar. And so the variation in cable type will have the most influence of any cable in your rig. So whatever you choose there is going to have some exaggeration of the tone based on the way that the cable is built. And all of us have different preferences as far as what our ears are attuned to and whether we prefer things with more mid-range or top end or whatever frequency you want, because they all affect the sound. It's just, how do you want it to affect the sound? And making that choice is going to be something that's very personalized. And we've done cable shootouts with input cables, and I even watched a recent video that Pete Thorne did on Cordial cables, and I thought that overall his video is pretty good. I think one thing that I think he missed, or that I wish I had seen, and maybe I missed this part if he did include this, is that different pickups will behave differently with different cables, and high and low gain amps will also behave differently with certain types of cables, because as we know, you can set up an EQ on a certain amp and it works really great with a certain type of cable that you've chosen that maybe exaggerates something that really works with that amp, and then you change to another amplifier and you change to, let's say, from humbucker to single coil, and then the cable type doesn't work so well anymore. The things that were exaggerated for that humbucker and that high gain amp are not as desirable with, low output single coil pickups in a super clean scooped amp. Yeah. And I found that the cable that works best in both of those scenarios, not having to change cable based on the setup, was Belden 9778 and Belden 8412. And 8412 is what Pete Cornish uses as his kind of expensive cable, and he dresses it up with, Tech Flex and color coded ends and all that stuff, and calls it a directional cable. I don't wire it in the way that he does, where he disconnects the shield on one end and floats it. People can debate this, but as far as directional cables are concerned, and all of us maybe have fallen victim to this at one time or the other. When I was younger and less experienced on the electronic side, I too was, believed in this mythology. But guitars are single-ended systems. They're not balanced. So a lot of guys that do this floated shield thing on twisted pair shielded cables, like an 8412 mic cable, which is what the one that Pete Cornish uses, which I think sounds really good, but it has no benefit of floating the shield, is that they're employing principles of a balanced system and applying them to a system that's inherently unbalanced, and those differences are just never going to be seen. And I think that their idea is that, okay, if you float the shield, that that the noise can't travel back, and create more airborne noise, or it's going to reduce any sort of airborne noise as a consequence of that. And it's just not the reality of it. And I will say the 8412 has a ton of capacitance. It sounds great to me and to most players that demoed it, both through clean amps and dirty amps with Les Pauls and Strats, because those were kind of our test subjects in test bed equipment. But it's like 90 picofarads per foot comparatively, because on a twisted pair shielded, you have two center conductors and a shield, and so you have a lot more capacitance than something like a 2524. So my picks for input cables, I think, sound the best in all of the different possible scenarios with all the different possible guitars consistently. Belden 8412 and Belden 9778. Both those cables are around $1.50 to $2 a foot, so not super expensive cable. And I think those sound the best. Now, in terms of plugs, I want to first say that I think silent plugs are great in name, but awful in practice. I've yet to find a silent plug that will withstand the test of time. I don't think Neutrik even offers lifetime warranties on them anymore because they were just so prone to failure. You might be able to get a little life out of them if you spray some contact cleaner, in the little, spring-loaded kind of mechanical piece that does the silent shorting. But they're kind of doomed to fail. The best results I've actually had with silent plugs are with the Switchcraft 181s, which is the Switchcraft version of a silent plug. That's been the best I've found, but even those are imperfect.
So they almost live up to their name too much. They're almost too silent.
Yeah. They become too silent after a while.
Yep.
And so I find that actually and this is going to be a very unsexy answer, but the cables that we sell as our input cables, and we sell them through Sweetwater and on our site, is a Belden 9778, and we either have it with Switchcraft 280 plugs or 180. So it's either the right angle or the straight standard Switchcraft, not silent. And those are, really good on capacitance comparatively to Neutrik and some of the other ones. And really kind of, just trusted, time-tested, great plugs. They're indestructible, made in Chicago, Illinois. Cut from a tree, right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say real quick with one thing I actually experienced, and this is actually on the output side of the board, is if you use like those silent plug jacks, and if they, on some of them, if they come unplugged even just the slightest, if they're unplugged. But I had one guy who had a whole loom full of them. I think it was like 5 cable method. They were all silent plugs for going to his amps and stuff. He's like, man, I'm getting no sound from my amps. And it was like, I'm not getting anything in and I'm not getting anything out. So like we had him switch out a couple cables, and he was like, I can tune, but now I'm not getting anything out. What is going on? And I was like, and I said, are all your plugs plugged in? And he goes, yeah, they're all plugged in. Nothing's unplugged. I was like, well, they're all silent plugs. Touch them. And he just goes, and they just like the tiniest of inch they were out, which they silenced all of his outputs. So that's another thing to be aware of, is they were cheaper plugs too. So like if you like the silent plugs, the more expensive ones are better quality because I found that cheaper ones from other companies, they'll pop out in the slightest. I don't know. There's something about it, and that was a rule of thumb: is be careful with those types of plugs. I don't do them.
Yeah, they're risky, and I should say they're only designed, and even Switchcraft and Neutrik will say this, they're only designed to be on the guitar. You shouldn't be putting silent plugs anywhere else.
Yeah, yep. Like I said, and that's what I said. I was like, probably don't do it on this, and they didn't want issues, which began issues.
One question I had, Mason, from hearing you describe it, and maybe I misunderstood. You mentioned that you like the Belden for the input and output cables.
Only input.
Only input.
Yeah. Only
but
input.
You also mentioned that they have quite high capacitance. So are you just not as concerned about capacitance there? Are there other factors that maybe I missed? Or I was just curious if you could explain that.
So I think that usually when we talk about cables, I think the X factor that a lot of people talk about, as we mentioned earlier, is the capacitance. How many picofarads per meter or per foot does the cable have? You know, in the plugs also, as we talked about, have some influence on that. But so one thing to be said about capacitance is that capacitance isn't capacitance isn't capacitance. In an example of this, follow me here for a second, is you can take, capacitors, which, is when we're talking about capacitance, we're basically, cable is a capacitor. Let's say you take two same value capacitors, and one is mica and one is ceramic, same exact value. They're going to sound different. And just as those two different types of capacitors will sound different with the same cable type, also cables will sound different depending on how they're made and depending on what the composition is of the cable. And so you can get some cables that don't sound dark at all, but have much higher capacitance than their counterparts. The other thing that I suspect is happening is on higher capacitance cables, it's changing where the resonant peak of the pickups are. Yep. And some people may prefer that. And when we did playing tests with we used all the different types of cables, and you can watch this on YouTube. We did a shootout with Justin Derrico, who's the lead guitar player for Pink, and also is on The Voice. He's like in the pit, with the band
Nice.
there. And he was basically going through everything from Evidence, Georgel, Canary, Mogami, the Belden cables, kind of stuff that you could get off the shelf. We kind of stuck with stuff that you could buy in bulk and make yourself. And basically we found that the Belden, even the 977 or the 9778 Belden, which it's not low capacitance, it's probably in the 40s. So it's not, like 20 or under like some of the really low capacitance cable is. What we found is that when some of those cables that had really low capacitance, they sounded great clean. Like a Georgel sounds beautiful into a Strat and a clean amp, really chimey and really exaggerates all kind of the airiness and etherealness of a single coil pickup. But as soon as you put that into a high gain, like a Soldano or a Friedman, it was really fizzy and unpleasant. And what we found about the Belden is maybe it had a little less of that chime, but still sounded very fat and warm and stratty. But when you went to that high gain amp, it didn't have any of those weird, really buzzy and kind of displeasing frequencies that you would hear on the Georgel or some of the other cables. And so I think, the capacitance is a thing to be aware of and concerned about, but not to undermine the overall tone. If you have a super low capacitance cable and you're finding that it sounds really peaky and displeasing with high gain amps, you need to rethink like what is actually the sound that you want when you're just plugging the cable right into the amplifier, and what is getting you closest to the sound that you hear in your head in whatever combination of amps you might use. And then once you've settled on that, that's now your input cable. And then, on the pedal board, you're going to use, the stuff that's easy to assemble, that works well. You're going to have good buffering, and so you can use stuff like the Mogami that we talked about. And then on your output cable, we can, I guess, migrate over to output cables. The one that goes back to the amp, that is also receiving a low output impedance signal. So that cable is significantly less important because you're already low impedance at that point. But, I would err on just having something that is reasonably low capacitance because, again, the cable that's most important is the one that has no signal conditioning. That's the one from the guitar going into the pedal board. All that's driving it is the pickups. Those are not great line drivers. They are totally passive. So that's the one where if you're going to spend big money on a cable and you're going to vet cables, that's where you want to do it. Guitar into the pedal board. Once it's on the pedal board, it's low impedance. I'd stick with the stuff that's easy to assemble, as we talked about. Mogami, 2319, 2314. Those are really great for this particular application. Low capacitance plugs like Square Plug, Mini Cakes, Goodwood Audio. These are good choices. And then the output, the cable that goes from the pedal board back to the amp, I go for something that's reasonably low capacitance. I usually use Mogami 2524 just because it's easy to get, it's inexpensive, it works really great, and at that point, again, everything's low impedance, so the differences between cable types, again, is not going to be that significant there.
Yeah.
There's not going to be a ton of difference between a Mogami, a Canary, an Evidence. Again, it's already low impedance, and if you have a really good quality buffer, again, like a Goodwood Audio or one of ours, the differences are going to be almost negligible.
Yeah. I do actually want to hear from you guys. Do you think you need to use an instrument cable if you're going out of your board? Because I see a lot of people do it. They have like sideboards. Actually, I have one up here. Like a sideboard like this for like their Iridium, their ACS1, or whatever they're using into like a direct box, or the new ones where people are using like 2 of the UA pedals. They're using those into direct boxes. But it's like a sideboard. Should I've actually had this question, and I'm curious what you guys think. Should they use instrument cables going out of their board into that kind of a system, or should it be as if it's acting like a pedal board, where it's just like a little bit of a longer patch cable?
I would probably use patch cables personally, and have in the past with great success. But I think you'd have to ask the question of how is it being patched in? Are there any areas there where it could compromise the longevity of the rig? Someone stepping on it, something happening where the patch cable, which are not as robust, could get damaged. But I've used patch cables for most of it, and I think that through, like I know you guys would as well. Like I just think through, how can I make sure this is bulletproof while still making it easy for the artist to set up and tear down night after night. And so plug choice is a big one, and then where it patches in and out. But I've used patch cables. If it's back at their amp, sometimes they'll put these B boards back at their amp and it's 20 feet away, then I'd use instrument cables. But if it's 1 or 2 feet, I usually stick with patch.
Okay.
I'm in agreement. I think it really comes down to if it's protected to the point where the plug is not going to create any risk, or the cable type is not going to create any risk to it being damaged or stepped on or anything like that, I would stick with patch cables. And if it's going to be further away, it's just really about the protecting the connections, and if it's safe, if it's isolated from everything else and not electronically isolated, but spatially isolated, where you don't have to worry about any sort of tripping hazard or thing like that, I wouldn't have any concern to use patch cables.
Yeah. Well, I meant to mention, if you're listening, what I was talking about was you'll see a lot of musicians that can't fit like an Iridium or a direct box or whatever on their board, so they have a secondary board. So utilizing different types. And my answer would be the same. A big part of it is like, if it is 20, 30 feet in the back, instrument cables. But if it's short, like a baby board right next to it, kind of like a sidekick board or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, I'm agree. Yeah, I wanted to get your input on that, because I have seen a lot of them lately, especially guys that have been running like the Ruby and the Dream by UA. Like they're a lot bigger pedal than one Iridium or an ACS1. So So thank you.
Some would say worth it though.
Yes.
Again, another podcast.
Yes.
Lots of ideas floating around here.
So, do we have any commentary on the output cable separately? We talked about the input cable being the really important one that's going to really have the most impact on the tone because that's being driven by passive pickups, and there's going to be a lot of variability there from cable to cable, depending on what you want to exaggerate. Pedalboard, pretty fixed, use the stuff that's going to be easy to assemble. We made our recommendations on what we use for plugs and cables. Yeah. On the output cable, my recommendation was kind of to use something that's reasonably low capacitance, but doesn't need to be like a real tone cable because, again, at that point, you're already converted to low impedance. By the time it gets there, there's going to be a pretty negligible difference between brands at that point. Do you guys have any input, no pun intended, on the output cable? And then maybe we can finish up with the discussion on solderless cables.
Ooh.
I mean, yeah. Go ahead, Grant.
I was just going to say, I don't really have much more to add. I think you've said it. So yeah, I'm happy to move on to solderless versus soldered. I don't know which one is going to win, but that's why we're here to chat about it.
Let's do it.
So, solderless cables. I'm still, as I've said to you before, I'm still waiting for the first solderless cable with a lifetime warranty. We haven't seen it yet.
Yep.
But I've seen some really interesting defenders, some apologists of solderless cables. And I think in some cases there could be some legitimacy for a DIYer that is not interested in learning the skill of soldering and wants to have some facility on customizing their pedal boarding cables. I can understand if that is where you're coming from and you don't feel a need to learn that skill, and maybe it's just not the level of the performances that you're doing or things like that just don't require that level of reliability of a soldered cable. I could understand it from that perspective. Where I do think there is no merit in solderless cables is when people start to say, well, X brand is just as good. This is just as good as soldered, or I've never had a problem with mine. I think it's one of those things where sometimes you have no idea how deteriorated the sound is sometimes because you don't have a reference of what things are actually supposed to sound like. Because solderless cables, things that they'll never be. One, gas tight. You're never going to have a gas tight connection. That means that they're always going to be high susceptibility to corrosion and oxidation. That is, bottom line, never going to change no matter what solderless cable you use, even if it screws in, if it's got a set screw, whatever it is, that doesn't change. Also, even if it does screw in, and let's just pretend that somehow they were able to get a gas tight connection, the shield is still not gas tight because on every single one of them, the shield is either it has a screw that either makes the contact, or you're folding the shield against the plug housing and then screwing it together. That is not gas tight. So even if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt and they make the claim that they're gas tight, which I don't think any of them do, the shield is still not gas tight, and so you're still doomed. And the more that you move them, the more that you manipulate them, the worse the connection erodes. So you're never going to get the quality of connection of a solderless cable. A solderless cable will never have the quality of connection of a soldered cable, both done the way that they need to, perfectly assembled in the way that the manufacturers recommend. As I said earlier, it's not or I guess I said earlier to you guys offline, it's not the cable that's the problem. If you have a solderless cable that you love the sound of, like a George L or an Evidence Audio, the cable is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that cable. You could take that cable and solder it to a specific plug and it'll be fine. And you'll get the sound that you like of that solderless cable and the reliability of it being soldered. The problem with solderless cables is the plugs themselves. And they're just never going to be as good in that regard. And if you want a professional level pedal board, this is why I can only think of one person in the entire industry that uses solderless cables. Only one. They are certainly the exception and not the rule. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I mean,
You go, Brian. Why don't you take it?
so in my experience, I'm just gonna say no off the bat to solderless. I have learned from my mistakes on doing them, and I did some solderless boards when I first started building, where like they were angled boards. I drilled through the deck. I ran the cable. Like you only like it was very to pedal the pedal. The issue is when you start yanking up those pedals to switch stuff out, the between the cabling and the plug, they start to have stress on each other, so it'll start to wiggle out, and that floating ground will get messed up. Or like on the lava stuff, I think I haven't done a lava cable in years for this reason, but I think it was like for the hot or the tip, you would click, like the cable clicks into the inner center part of the plug or whatever. Like those could come dislodged, and it's the same thing that could technically happen with a soldered cable. A soldered cable could break. There's something could happen, but there is a less likely of a chance of something breaking on a soldered cable because you have heat shrink, or you have the plug is clamping down on the inside for stuff not to move, where a lot of these solderless plugs, like it's just like a cap that sits on top, like and it bends it to that 45 degree, and if you get a screw. But yeah, no, I had them starting out, and I learned real quickly how big of a difference it made by some of the stuff that I had, and I just from there on just don't touch it.
Playing devil's advocate here, I just came up with an idea I'm going to start developing, which is a rack system that is vacuum sealed. Gas tight connection fixed. You will not be able to open up this rack, but you can use solderless cables. So long as you don't touch the pedals, so long as you don't look at it the wrong way, your solderless cables will last the test of time.
So is this like a shadow box rack where it's like all sealed off?
It's all sealed.
Perfect.
Fully sealed. Yeah, it's going to work. But I will say, in all seriousness, that is not happening. But the convenience factor, like Mason was pointing to, of solderless cables is massive. It is so much easier to make a solderless cable if you don't know how to solder. You don't want to invest into that. So I can totally understand. But I'm not saying this facetiously, if reliability is big on your list, if you don't, want to run the risk of a failing cable mid-gig, then soldered is really, really your only choice. And even on the strain relief side, for the pedalboard patch cable side of things, you do, and this is controversial again, you don't need strain relief on a cable. It is an extra layer of security, but even like the Switchcraft 380s, those short body straights, they're literally 2 solder connections, no strain relief. So long as the cable isn't being plugged and unplugged over and over again, and you're not pulling the cables out by the cable itself, but you're pulling it out by the plug, strain relief is really not needed. And Mason, please disagree with me.
No, I mean, when you're saying strain relief, you're talking about like the heat shrink, or are you talking about
just
like actual clamps?
A clamp or some sort of pressure on the cable jacket itself to ease pressure on the solder joints.
Well, I think the clamp helps with pulling. Heat shrink helps with lateral movement.
Yep.
I think the heat shrink is not needed on most connections, especially if the plug is designed for the cable type. Like there's some cases where if you use 2314, let's say, in a Switchcraft 228, that cable will just be floating in that housing, and you're going to want to build it up with some heat shrink just to eliminate the lateral movement. But on any pancake plug, there is no strain relief clamp for a pull. And that's where, like on a Switchcraft 280 or something like that, which is the right angle, I think it's 280 is the right angle plug, or a 180, which is the straight plug. Those have a clamp. Those are great to help remove any sort of, pulls, but doesn't, and does some to lateral movement, but really it's really to help it with the pull. I think on a pedal board, 380, obviously you have no strain relief at all. I think I think the versions that Creation does have a strain relief on it.
Ours does as well. Like
Yours
it's
does
there
as
and
well.
it's helpful, but all I'm saying is it's not like a make or break. You must have. Strain
No, I don't
relief.
think it's a must. I think it's helpful. I think it's good to have. And obviously, you know, most of us at one point or the other, all we had was 380s, and so we had to use that, and we had no other choice. And for the most part, those held up really well, especially if you built them up a little bit with heat shrink just to kind of eliminate some of the lateral movement, and you just had to be really deliberate about cutting the center conductor and the grounds really short so that you could kind of get as much of the cable insulation buried inside of the plug so that you could, you know, protect the leads as much as possible, because if you weren't careful, you'd have, you know, some of it sticking out of the housing, which wasn't so attractive.
Very bad.
But I only say about the strain relief because I get a lot of people, and I think it's more of those, like, the quality is like, you'll get some guys that are like, thanks for making the cables, and they'll throw them on the board. But then you'll get some guys that will inspect the cable. They open it up, they're curious, they want to look inside, they want to see how it looks. And I had a couple people like, oh man, the cable's just floating here. So it became more of like, I was using the short straight switchcraft plugs for a while, and then when something with that little clamp anchor, whatever we want to call it, came out, it became like, not for me, but it was for the person, the buyer, of like an extra layer of protection for them, because they're like, oh, I've done it before. I've gotten really ticked at something that I was trying to do, and I can't get the pedal off, and I just yanked the cable off. And
I don't believe it.
Yes. Oh no, it happens all the time.
It.
You should.
Brian
I work in the back. No, not in the slightest. But like, it's just like things that you don't think about doing, and then like. But yeah, I've had, let's be honest, we're all kind of curious, and I've had people that are like, oh yeah, like I got the cable and it's beautiful and everything, but like the plug kind of spins around. So like that's where like I agree with you guys. It's not a make or break. It's kind of like that extra level of security, of ease of that person getting it to where they're not like, I'm not totally gonna mess up all this cabling I just got, kind of thing.
And on the pedal board, I think it's less problematic. Off the pedal board, this would be a problem.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And I know, Brian, you got to wrap up here because you're going to start your work day. I don't know if you want to give us a last word before you check out, and then Grant and I can complete, if that helps get you on the road for your day.
I can do a couple more minutes if we want to finish. I can finish out with you guys.
Okay.
I just told them to wait.
One last thing that I would say on solderless cables that's something that's come up because we've done some content on this in the past, is that sometimes the thing that people will use as sort of their ransoming of solderless cables is they'll say, well, even in high technology, really elite technology, whether it's automobiles or space shuttles, there are examples of solderless connections in these
in space.
In space,
in a vacuum. Yep. Okay.
And
in a vacuum.
And the thing that I would say to this is this response. Firstly, if you're talking about, let's say, like ribbon wires that are connected with different types of let's say, clamps or connections that are done, solderless, but are using some sort of tension or some sort of pins that connect two ribbon cables together for different circuit boards, let's say a daughter board and a main board. Firstly, in a spaceship, they're not exposed. So they're not in high use areas like a pedal board, which is getting moved. Pedals are getting manipulated, getting plugged and unplugged, changing things out, right? They're not exposed. The second thing that I would say is in most other industries that are using, let's say, a solderless connection, a lot of times they're using crimping tools for their solderless applications that actually cold weld the connections together. We have no such calibrated crimping tools that are used as a component of creating solderless cables. In other words, the solderless manufacturers are not providing a calibrated crimping machine which is allowing you to crimp the center conductor to the plug itself. And even if they did, you'd have to calibrate it all the time to ensure that you were getting the same pressure with every connection that you were making. So it's not really a one-to-one thing to say, well, NASA has areas where they use solderless connections, or, you know, Ferrari and Maserati or Rolls-Royce uses solderless connections in their radios or their, you know, CD players, of course, have that anymore, or their whatever it is. It's not exactly the same thing, because those, again, aren't exposed. They're not available for the customer to manipulate, change, reorder, etc. These things are hidden, they're buried, and the way that they're crimped are used by calibrated machines that are designed explicitly to do this, which would make solderless cables, again, way too expensive to be able to purchase if you had to buy a crimping tool that was calibrated for the exact weight that needed to be applied in order to, you know, pressure fit a connection or cold weld a connection to the plug. So it's just not the same thing.
Agreed.
Fair call. And at that point, just easier to learn how to use a soldering iron.
Just learn how to use a soldering iron. It'll be less expensive than that calibrated crimping machine that you would need. So, guys, I think we got a little closer to Tone Town today through this conversation of cables. And of course, if you're listening to this and you have disagreements, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. We're happy to go. At least I'm happy to go toe to toe with any solderless apologist, and we can get you on the righteous path. You know, and you know, and I will continue to evangelize soldered cables until I'm no longer here, and
we'll be right there with you.
And you'll be right, yeah, yep, and I think that'll all be on our tombstones when we're gone. It was great to see everybody, and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, or give us a thumbs up and a comment if you're watching it on YouTube.
Love it.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
See you guys.